The promise of love can sometimes be the cruelest betrayal of all. Imagine discovering that the person you trusted most invited your tormentor to witness what should have been your moment of triumph. Have you ever felt the sickening realization that someone had been playing a long, calculated game with your heart, your trust, and your very life? That hollow feeling in your chest, that moment when the world seems to stop spinning and everything you believed collapses in an instant, is what our story explores today. The hot, humid air of Louisiana in 1857 clung to the skin like a wet blanket, carrying with it the mingled scents of magnolia blossoms and the muddy waters of the Mississippi. On the Beaumont plantation, the white columns of the main house gleamed in the morning sun, a deceptive image of order and gentility that masked the brutality that sustained it. Here, amid the sprawling fields of cotton that stretched toward the horizon, lived Thomas, an enslaved man whose intelligence and dignified bearing had earned him the dangerous position of being a house servant, constantly in proximity to the master and mistress of the plantation. Eleanor Beaumont, the young wife of plantation owner Richard Beaumont, moved through the grand house like a beautiful ghost, her pale skin and golden hair creating an ethereal presence that contrasted with the dark wood paneling of the halls. Married at 18 to a man 20 years her senior, she had quickly discovered that her husband had little interest in her beyond the social status her family name provided and the heir she was expected to produce. Richard was a cold, calculating man whose true passion lay in expanding his wealth and influence, spending long months away on business in New Orleans or Charleston, leaving his young bride alone in the sprawling mansion with only the enslaved house servants for company. Thomas had been brought to the Beaumont plantation 5 years earlier, purchased specifically because of his literacy and mathematical abilities, valuable skills that Richard exploited to keep his accounts in order while maintaining the fiction to business associates that it was his own meticulous record-keeping that kept the plantation profitable. 30 years old and born into slavery in Virginia, Thomas had been separated from his wife and infant son when his previous owner died in debt, a wound that remained raw despite the passing years. Now he moved silently through the Beaumont household, his eyes always lowered in the presence of whites, his true thoughts locked away behind a carefully maintained mask of servility. The summer heat had descended early that year, and with it came the annual departure of Richard Beaumont for his extended business dealings in the city. The evening after his departure, as Thomas was organizing ledgers in the study, Eleanor entered the room wearing a light cotton dress that clung to her frame in the humid evening air. She closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silent room. This was not the first time she had sought him out when they were alone in the house. Over the previous months, their interactions had evolved from brief, furtive conversations about books she had discovered he could read to longer discussions where, for brief moments, the vast social gulf between them seemed to narrow. In those stolen moments, Thomas felt something he had not experienced since being torn from his family years ago: recognition of his humanity. Eleanor moved closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper as she described her loneliness, her dreams of a different life, a life she claimed she could now envision with him in it. Thomas felt the dangerous pull of her words, knowing well the deadly consequences that would follow if her interest in him became known, yet unable to fully resist the only tenderness offered to him in this place of cruelty. That night marked the beginning of a secret relationship that would ultimately lead to betrayal, more painful than either could imagine at that moment of first intimate connection. Over the following weeks, their clandestine meetings continued, always initiated by Eleanor, always fraught with danger for Thomas, who had no illusions about where the blame would fall if they were discovered. Yet, despite the risk, he found himself drawn to these encounters, not just for the physical comfort they provided, but for the whispered promises Eleanor made in the darkness. She spoke of her plans to convince her husband to grant Thomas special privileges, perhaps even purchase his wife and child from their owner in Virginia. She painted a future where they could continue their relationship under the guise of her special interest in her husband's most valuable servant. These promises, spoken with seeming sincerity in intimate moments, planted dangerous seeds of hope in Thomas, who had long ago learned that hope was the most painful luxury for someone in his position. Unknown to both of them, Richard Beaumont had grown suspicious of his wife's behavior during his previous absences. Before his departure this time, he had instructed the overseer, a brutal man named Harlan, to keep close watch on the main house and report any unusual activities. Harlan, who had always resented Thomas's privileged position in the household and the education that elevated him above other enslaved people on the plantation, was eager for any opportunity to bring him down. For weeks, he observed from a distance, noting the late hours Eleanor spent in the study with Thomas, the way their hands occasionally brushed when passing objects, the lingering glances that passed between them when they thought no one was watching. On a particularly hot night in August, with cicadas creating a deafening chorus in the trees surrounding the plantation house, Harlan positioned himself beneath the partially open window of Eleanor's bedroom. There he witnessed what he had suspected. The mistress of the plantation and the enslaved bookkeeper locked in an embrace that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The overseer smiled in the darkness, already composing the letter he would send to Richard Beaumont in New Orleans, knowing it would bring him favor with the master and satisfy his long-standing grudge against Thomas. Meanwhile, within the candlelit bedroom, Eleanor was making her most ambitious promises yet. She spoke of a future where they might escape together to the north, or perhaps to Europe, where they could live as husband and wife away from the oppressive society of the South. Her words painted a picture so vivid that Thomas, despite his natural caution and the hard lessons of his life, found himself beginning to believe. When she mentioned that she had been secretly setting aside money from her household allowance, showing him a small leather pouch filled with gold coins that could fund their escape, his skepticism further eroded. That night, for the first time, he allowed himself to fully embrace the dangerous emotion he had been fighting: love for a woman who, in the eyes of the society they lived in, could never truly be his. The letter from Harlan reached Richard Beaumont as he was concluding a major cotton sale to European buyers. The carefully worded message, which suggested improprieties but avoided direct accusations that might provoke immediate, potentially financially disruptive action, achieved its intended effect. Richard decided to conclude his business quickly and return to the plantation unannounced to see for himself what was occurring in his absence. He departed New Orleans without sending the customary message ahead to prepare for his arrival, his mind filled with calculations not of passion or jealousy, but of property and reputation. On the plantation, unaware of the approaching storm, Eleanor had become increasingly bold in her relationship with Thomas. She now regularly summoned him to her bedroom at night, no longer bothering with the pretense of needing assistance with household accounts or other such excuses. Among the other house servants, whispers had begun, quickly silenced whenever Thomas entered a room. He felt the change in the atmosphere, the growing danger, but Eleanor's promises and his own carefully nurtured hope clouded his judgment. When she told him she had written to contacts in Boston who could help them once they fled north, he believed her. When she said she had secured documents that could help him pass as a free man during their journey, he did not question how this would have been possible. The web of deception was tightening around him, though he could not yet see it. On a sultry September evening, as Thomas and Eleanor lay together in her bed, the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive shattered their forbidden intimacy. Through the window in the light of the full moon, they could clearly see Richard Beaumont stepping down from the carriage, his expression grim as he looked up at the master bedroom window where their silhouettes were likely visible. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Rather than panic or attempt to hide Thomas, she calmly rose from the bed, put on her robe, and instructed him to remain exactly where he was. With a cold composure that should have been his first true warning, she told him this confrontation was inevitable and perhaps even necessary for their plans. Then she left the room, closing the door behind her, to greet her husband. Thomas, his heart pounding with fear and confusion, quickly dressed and pressed his ear to the door. From below he could hear raised voices, then a chilling silence. Minutes later, heavy footsteps ascended the stairs, accompanied by Eleanor's lighter tread. Instead of fleeing or hiding, Thomas found himself frozen in place, the multiple layers of danger in his situation overwhelming his ability to act. The bedroom door swung open to reveal Richard Beaumont, his face a mask of cold fury, with Eleanor standing slightly behind him, her expression unreadable. What happened next would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. Instead of the immediate violent response he expected, Richard turned to his wife and spoke in a controlled, almost conversational tone. He asked how long this had been going on, and Eleanor, her voice steady, replied that it had begun almost immediately after their marriage. Then, in words that fell like hammer blows, she explained that every intimate moment, every whispered plan for escape, every promise of a life together, had been part of an elaborate scheme conceived by her and Richard before their marriage. Their goal, to identify and neutralize any enslaved people on the plantation with dangerous ideas about freedom or equality, using Eleanor as bait for those who might be susceptible to such manipulation. Thomas had been identified early as a potential threat due to his education and the respect he commanded among the other enslaved people. The revelation hit Thomas with physical force, causing him to stagger backward. As Richard explained with cold precision that his business trips had been part of the deception, designed to create opportunities for Eleanor to identify those who might harbor rebellious thoughts, Thomas felt something break inside him. Every moment he had treasured, Every hope he had cautiously nurtured was revealed as a calculated move in a game whose rules had been hidden from him. The intimacy he had believed was genuine was nothing more than a tool of control, a method of surveillance more insidious than any overseer's whip. Eleanor, now standing beside her husband with her hand possessively on his arm, watched Thomas's devastation with clinical detachment. She explained that his response to her seduction had confirmed their suspicions about his dangerous ideals and potential influence on others. As a final twist of the knife, she revealed that she had been sharing detailed accounts of their conversations with her husband all along, including Thomas's expressed desires for freedom and his willingness to flee the plantation. In the eyes of the law and society, this amounted to evidence of planned escape, a severely punishable offense. Rather than having him immediately punished, however, Richard announced a different fate for Thomas: to make an example of him and to break any spirit of resistance among the other enslaved people on the plantation. Thomas would be sold to a notoriously brutal sugar plantation in the deepest part of Louisiana. But before that, he would be forced to witness a ceremony celebrating Richard and Eleanor's enduring union and successful deception. A renewal of their wedding vows was to be held the following weekend, with all the enslaved people of the plantation required to attend, and Thomas given the especially humiliating role of personal attendant to Richard throughout the event. The days leading up to the ceremony were a blur of despair for Thomas. Stripped of his position in the house, he was confined to a small outbuilding under constant guard, brought out only for Richard to parade him before other enslaved workers as an example of the consequences of overstepping one's place. The physical blows were almost welcome compared to the psychological torture of knowing how completely he had been deceived, how thoroughly his trust had been weaponized against him. At night, alone in the darkness, he replayed every conversation with Eleanor. Seeing now the careful manipulation behind each seemingly heartfelt exchange, he recognized how she had expertly identified his deepest vulnerabilities: the longing for his lost family, his secret pride in his education, his carefully hidden desire for freedom, and exploited each one to gain his trust and ultimately betray him. The day of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed to mock Thomas's suffering. Dressed in formal livery that had been specially made for the occasion, he was positioned directly behind Richard during the elaborate renewal of vows. Eleanor, resplendent in a gown of ivory silk, her golden hair adorned with flowers, played her role of devoted wife to perfection. As she recited promises of fidelity and devotion, her eyes occasionally flicked to Thomas, gauging the impact of each word on the man whose trust she had so completely betrayed. The assembled guests, wealthy plantation owners from across the region, who had been told a sanitized version of events positioning Thomas as an ungrateful servant who had taken advantage of the mistress's kindness, watched the proceedings with approval, seeing in this display a reaffirmation of the social order they all depended upon. What none of them knew, what even the ever-vigilant Harlan had failed to discover, was that during his confinement, Thomas had managed to conceal a small item beneath the floorboards of the outbuilding where he was held. It was the leather pouch containing gold coins that Eleanor had shown him, which she had carelessly left in the bedroom during their final encounter. In the chaos following Richard's return, neither she nor anyone else had noticed its absence. Now, as he stood behind Richard, the pouch was sewn into a hidden pocket in his livery, its weight against his chest a constant reminder of what was to come. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Thomas performed his duties with mechanical precision, his face an expressionless mask that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. He served drinks to Richard and his guests, enduring their condescending remarks and occasionally cruel jokes at his expense. Eleanor, playing the role of gracious hostess, avoided direct interaction with him, though he could feel her eyes following him throughout the evening. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit around the garden where the reception was being held, Richard called for attention, raising his glass in a toast to his wife and their future together. It was at this moment, with all eyes fixed on the plantation owner, that Thomas made his move. With the practiced silence of someone who had spent a lifetime moving unnoticed through white spaces, Thomas slipped away from the gathering. Using the cover of growing darkness and the distraction of the celebration, he made his way to the stables where horses were kept ready for guests' departure. There, he swiftly saddled Richard's prized stallion, a powerful animal that could cover great distances at speed. As he worked, his mind was clear for the first time in weeks, focused entirely on the immediate tasks of escape, rather than the paralyzing pain of betrayal. The gold coins would be enough to bribe his way onto a ship heading north from New Orleans, or perhaps to pay for passage all the way to Canada. The detailed knowledge of plantation operations and local geography that he had acquired over years of managing accounts now served a new purpose, providing him with information about patrol routes and the safest paths through the swamps and forests. Just as he was leading the horse quietly away from the stables, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Lily, an older woman who had been enslaved on the plantation since childhood and had been something of a mother figure to many, including Thomas. Without a word, she pressed a small bundle into his hands, food wrapped in cloth, a water flask, a small knife. Her eyes, wise and sorrowful, told him she understood both his actions and the desperate circumstances that drove them. With a quick embrace, she disappeared back toward the house, her silent support the only genuine human connection in a world of deception. As the sounds of the celebration faded behind him, Thomas rode into the night, the weight of chains both physical and psychological beginning to lift with each mile he put between himself and the Beaumont plantation. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. Richard would pursue him relentlessly, not just for the perceived insult to his authority, but for the practical value of an educated slave and the expensive horse he had taken. The journey north would be fraught with danger, every white face a potential threat, every interaction a possible trap. Yet for the first time since his capture and sale years ago, Thomas felt something like freedom stirring within him, a freedom not granted by others, but seized through his own action. Back at the plantation, the alarm was raised when Thomas's absence was discovered. Richard, his face purple with rage, immediately organized search parties, offering substantial rewards for his recapture. Eleanor, however, received the news of the escape with an unsettling calm, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Only later that night, as she prepared for bed, did her composure crack when she discovered the missing pouch of gold coins, her personal savings, not household money as she had claimed to Thomas, which she had been secretly accumulating for years as insurance against an unhappy marriage. In stealing only this rather than more valuable but traceable items from the house, Thomas had ensured that Eleanor could not report the theft without revealing her own deception of her husband. His final act had been not just escape but a form of justice that would force her to continue living within the lies she had created. The search for Thomas continued for months, extending into neighboring states as reports surfaced of a well-spoken black man making his way north. Some claimed he had been seen boarding a ship in New Orleans, others that he had joined a community of escaped slaves hiding in the swamplands. Richard Beaumont, obsessed with recapturing him, spent increasing amounts of money on professional slave catchers, neglecting his business interests in the process. Eleanor, trapped in a marriage that had been revealed as a mutual arrangement of convenience now stripped of trust on both sides, watched as her husband's fixation gradually undermined the wealth and social position that had been her primary motivation for the union. As for Thomas, stories would occasionally reach the plantation through the underground network that connected enslaved communities across the South. It was said that he had indeed made it to Canada, where he had used his education and business knowledge to establish himself as a teacher and a speaker, sharing his experiences to strengthen the abolitionist cause. Some accounts suggested he had even managed to locate and reunite with his wife and son, though whether this represented truth or merely the desperate hope of those still in bondage could never be confirmed. What was certain was that his escape had become a whispered legend among the enslaved population of the region, a testament to the possibility of freedom against seemingly impossible odds, and a reminder that even the most elaborate systems of control contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with the courage and intelligence to recognize them. In the years that followed, as the nation moved inexorably toward civil war, the Beaumont plantation fell into decline. Richard's obsession with finding Thomas diverted his attention from changing market conditions, leading to financial difficulties that were exacerbated by increasing political instability. Eleanor, her youthful beauty fading with the passage of time, and the corrosive effects of living within a web of mutual deception, found herself increasingly isolated in the grand house that had once symbolized all she had aspired to. The legacy of their cruel manipulation of Thomas lived on, not as the cautionary example for other enslaved people that they had intended, but as a warning about the ultimate fragility of power built on deception and the enduring strength of the human spirit's drive for freedom. In the end, the story of Thomas, Eleanor, and Richard Beaumont reminds us that betrayal cuts deepest when it exploits our most human need for connection and understanding. But it also teaches us that even in our darkest moments of disillusionment, the capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action can transform victimhood into agency. Thomas entered the renewed wedding celebration as a man whose trust had been weaponized against him, but left it having reclaimed his narrative and set in motion a new chapter of his life, defined not by what was done to him, but by what he chose to do in response. Viewers, have you ever experienced a betrayal that forced you to completely reimagine your path forward? How did you find the strength to transform that moment of devastating clarity into an opportunity for liberation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember that sharing these reflections creates connections that help others recognize they are not alone in navigating the aftermath of broken trust. If these stories of courage and betrayal during the slavery era touch your heart as they touch mine, I invite you to join our community. By subscribing to the channel, you'll have access to carefully researched stories that reveal long-hidden truths about our past, helping to understand wounds that still echo in our society. It's not just about knowing history, but about honoring the memory of those who lived these realities. Click subscribe and let's journey together in discovery and reflection.